Okay, welcome everyone. We'll begin in just about a minute. Hi Zella, welcome. I'm putting the sources here. I'm putting the sources here in the chat on Zoom, but I'll also put them on Facebook. So welcome to everyone who will be watching us live on Facebook. I'll put the sources for you here as a comment on Facebook as well. I'll do that right now so you can follow us independently if you prefer. They are now in the chat here on Zoom and also on Facebook. And again, welcome to a few more people. Welcome, Debbie. We'll get started. So once again, welcome to those who are here on Zoom with us, but also those who are watching us live on Facebook. This class is part of Drisha's Spring Zman, discussions on the Parashah. This week we have Tazria with Rabbi Jon Kelsen. Rabbi Jon Kelsen is the Chief Education Officer here at Drisha. Just a couple words about how we run the class. If you receive an invitation here on Zoom to become a panelist, it just means that you'll be able to unmute if you'd like to participate in class, which we hope you will. It would also allow you to turn on your video if you want to show us your smiling face, but you don't have to. You can also keep your video off. You can engage in writing also here in the chat on Zoom or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. And just a reminder, we want to, so everyone can hear well in class, just to stay muted when you're not speaking, and I'll help mute you as needed. And just remember to unmute so we can hear you when you speak. And with that, I'll turn this to you, John.
Okay, thanks so much, Evie. Welcome, everybody. Great to see you. Who do we see here? I see Zella. Great to see you. I haven't seen you for a while. Hope you're well.
Yeah, missed those o'clock classes.
Yeah. Okay, well, good to have you here. Debbie, good to see you. Emily, I know you're here. We were just here before. And I've seen attendees, Susan. Okay, terrific. Awesome. So I think I've learned with all of you before in this one context or another, but I would love to, for this to be as interactive as possible. The Zoom restrictions notwithstanding. So please, jump in with ideas and thoughts and questions and anything as we're going. So we're in Parashah Tazria. We're also approaching Pesach. I'll note that normally in a non-leap year, normally Tazria and Metzora are paired together, but as it's a leap year, we have Tazria as a standalone, which gives us both the challenge and the opportunity to engage with it itself, Tazria proper, in a bit greater depth. I do want to say before we jump into Tazria, kind of two introductory remarks, or make two introductory notes, and then we'll talk a little bit about Tazria, especially Tzara'at. We'll call it, whatever the Tzara'at disease is, however best to translate that, leprosy or otherwise, but focusing heavily on Tzara'at and its meaning. And then I wanted to sort of float an idea as to sort of a broader idea. I'll leave it at that. A broader idea about the sort of the function of much of these laws and within the context of Sefer Vayikra and beyond. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But two introductory points, or which sort of come together into one. First of all, we are approaching Pesach, and I wanted to note, therefore, that let me start from here. For those of you who were here a few weeks ago, we were learning together the end of Parashat Shemot, Sefer Shemot, Parashat Pekudei. This is not on your source sheets. Let me just remind you if you were here, and if you were not here, here's a little point. The end of the book of Exodus, Parashat Pekudei, this is chapter 40 of Exodus, after building the Mishkan, has this focus on the cloud. The text there says, the end of chapter 40, the end of the book of Exodus, that the cloud covered the Ohel Moed, Vayachasa Anan et Ohel Moed, and God's glory, Chavod Hashem, God's presence, God's glory fills the Mishkan. And Moshe can't go into the Mishkan, to the Ohel Moed, Moshe can't enter the Ohel Moed. This is how the book ends. Interestingly, it ends with Moshe not able to enter, rather than Moshe able to enter. Moshe is not able to enter the Ohel Moed because God's presence is there, and it's the cloud is resting upon it, and God's chavod is filling up the Mishkan. That's one moment in the text here, and then the final verses speak of the travels and the function of the cloud and the travels of Bnei Israel. When the cloud would rise up from the Mishkan, then Bnei Israel would travel in all of their travels, and if it would not rise up, verse 36, 37, excuse me, they wouldn't move. If it didn't move, they moved. If it didn't move, they didn't move. Okay, for the cloud of God was on the tabernacle by day, fire on it at night, before the eyes of all of Beit Israel in all of their travels, and that's the end of the book. So when we were learning Parashah Pekudei, any of you here a few weeks ago when we did Pekudei here in the Jewish Shir? I don't recall. Okay, so I'll just share on one foot, and then I think that's recorded and it's probably findable. Is an idea triggered by Rabbi Jon Kelsen. Rabbi Jon Kelsen noticed that though both, all of these verses discuss the Anan, there seem to be two foci here, and those two foci are very, very significant with regards to the books which come after Exodus. There's one book which comes after it, which is Leviticus, which is Vayikra, but there's another book also, which is after Leviticus, which is Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, the story of the travels in the desert. So he noticed that the first two verses here, 34 and 35 in Exodus 40, speak of the cloud filling up the Mishkan and Moshe not being able to enter the Mishkan because God's glory is upon it. And he noticed that seems to get that thread, that notion gets picked up on in the very beginning of the next book, Sefer Vayikra. Vayikra Moshe, that God's glory fills the Mishkan and Moshe can't enter, much like what happened on Mount Sinai when God's cloud is on top of it and Moshe can't enter until God calls him in. So to here, Moshe can't enter the tabernacle until Vayikra Moshe, beginning of Vayikra Vayikra Moshe, and God spoke to Moshe saying, Moshe spoke to him from the Ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting saying, and then we launch into Sefer Vayikra. So on the one hand, you have the segue from the end of Exodus into Vayikra, into Sefer Vayikra. That's like one thread that gets picked up on the end of Exodus. But he noticed, or he posited, and I think it's very compelling, that there's sort of a split because that's the part of those verses go into Vayikra. But the very, very last verses of Exodus about the cloud traveling and Bnei Israel's travels gets picked up not in Vayikra so much as in Bamidbar. And especially, first of all, with the Bnei Israel's travels in the desert. So right away you understand that we're basically in Bamidbar, specifically.
Perek Yud.
Thank you. I was just flipping over to it. Right. Is it Perek Yud or Perek? Is it already maybe Tet? Let me find it. Which verse in Yud? Yeah, I see it already in Perek Tet, but I guess Yud as well, right? But in Perek Tet already in Numbers verse 15, right? When Uveyom Hakima Mishkan, the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covers it, and then it talks about all their travels when they were traveling, when they were not travel. And then Yud, was it Debbie? You said Yud. What were you noticing? Oh, and Suri's here. Great. Let's make Suri a panelist. What were you noticing, Debbie and Yud?
Yeah, I think don't you have the nuns there? And it says when they traveled, it went up, and if it was Yom, if it was Chodesh.
Yeah, Eben saw Haron, right? The inverted nuns. Excellent. Okay, so that it gets picked up there as well. But the focus on the clouds, especially itself, that's really already in Tet. So it doesn't. That doesn't. If our purposes, doesn't make much of a difference. The point is that it gets picked up on in Bamidbar. So you kind of have two ends of two sequels or whatever, two texts which pick up from the end of Exodus, as Yoel ben Nun. One going into Vayikra, and that's the story of God calling Moshe into the tabernacle to speak to him, or calling him from the tabernacle to speak to him, and offer the rest of Sefer Vayikra. And then the story of the travels in the desert, which is Bamidbar. And we noticed also that in a way those two books are, I mean, they're very different books, right? We could characterize them in various ways, but one is, I mean, Vayikra is relative to, I'd say, the narrative dynamism, right, of the Midbar. Vayikra is relatively static. I mean, narratively speaking, there's a few narratives, but mostly it's a book of prescription, of halachot, and the picture there, it's sort of, you see, picture is one which is, I think, again, relatively more static, more standstill. It's less of a plot moving forward as much as a sort of a depiction, and it's a depiction of a type of world, a world in which the presence of God has shifted, as the Ramban posits, right, or notices. The presence of God within the camp has shifted from Mount Sinai, and the place where one encounters God and speaks to God, hears from God, has moved from Sinai into the camp proper, v'shachanti b'tocham, into the Mishkan, and a whole world around that Mishkan. How does one protect that Mishkan? What occurs there? What kind of people we must be in general to coexist with God at the center, etc. So that's the story of Vayikra writ large, and Midbar is a different type of story. It's a dynamic story about a march forward with, I'd say it's less in a way, if Vayikra is describing more of a theoretical world, maybe we call it an ideal in a sense. The Midbar is certainly more real. Midbar is nothing if not real. An extremely real story. A very human story as much as it's a divine story. So we're here and now in Vayikra, in the depiction of that world. And since we're approaching Pesach, the second point I just wanted to make quickly is that I was just actually, so I'm here in Israel, as you may know, and I was just teaching at the incredible Yeshivat Risha. I had the privilege of teaching there earlier in the week. If you haven't had a chance, by the way, to visit, please be in touch next time you're here, and I would love to, make an arrangement or try to, arrange for a visit. It's really an extraordinary place. So I had the privilege, since it was in Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and the yeshiva there was learning Masechet Shavuot about so we had a topic which has to do with the intersection of the laws of oaths on the one hand, and a Pesach related topic which has to do with the laws of workers and their hirers, right? Workers and bosses. And interestingly, and the point I want to make right now is simply that the laws of work relationships, of employment relationships, are limited or are guided to some extent. It's a deep topic, but to some extent by the laws of Avdut, by the laws relative to not the work relationship, but to the laws of servitude or call it biblical slavery, especially of the Eved Ivri, of the Jewish Eved, the Jewish slave. And what we can note if we're learning Sefer Vayikra now is that Vayikra, Parshat Bahar, towards the end of Sefer Vayikra, includes amongst other topics, includes a focus on the laws of Avdut, right? The laws of how one is to treat one's Eved, especially how one is to treat one's Eved Ivri, right? One's fellow Jew who has come across hard times and is now, rather than being an independent, let's say subsistence farmer, for example, is now working, forced into working for somebody else, and the laws about that. Prominently, the law that the Eved is not only to be sort of treated oppressively, but also that their engagement with their Adon, with their master, is temporary. Right? The Eved Ivri is not a permanent relationship. At least not ideally, at least not as conveyed there, right? He's meant to go free after 6 years of service or the Yovel, or the Jubilee year. It's a temp relation because God says there, because these are my servants, or the Israel are Avadayim. These are my servants. They're Avadim Li. They are servants unto me. I am the true master of them, as the Midrash says it. Shtari Kodem, my document of my claim on them, right? My document of ownership precedes and thus supersedes human ownership or claim upon these people, upon the Jews, and therefore the relationship with one's human adon, or human master, is by definition not only limited in quality, if you will, is to say, in how they may treat them, but also in, again, quantity, if you will, meaning it's a limited engagement, has to end at some point. Okay, at least ideally. And what's interesting is that actually kind of forms an envelope structure, closing a piece which opens with Parshat Mishpatim, which the covenant, the Mishpatim covenant, right, which starts with the laws of Eved Ivri, Ki Tikneh Eved Ivri, Sheishim Ya'avod V'Asher Yitzil Chavshi Chinam. That there's the same notion that the Eved Ivri has to be set free. It's a temporary relationship, because in the book of Exodus, and here's my point regarding Pesach, the book of Exodus, and then it gets sort of follow up with at the tail end, Bahar Sinai, right? Parshat Bahar, the end of Vayikra, it sort of opens and closes with the point that the Bnei Israel are taken out of Abdut Mitzrayim, are taken out of the slavery and servitude of the Egyptian servitude of serving Pharaoh, but they're freed not into sort of some sort of open, unclaimed universe, to Hefkerut. They're actually transitioned from Abdut for Mitzrayim, Abdut for Pharaoh, into servitude or service, if you will, of God. Right? And God says actually in the beginning of Exodus that they'll be taken out to Moshe. Right? I mean, you're going to take them out of this land, and they're going to worship me, Tavdunoti. They're going to worship me at this place. So the idea of avodah doesn't disappear with the exodus from Egypt. Avodah continues. It's also melacha. I understand a different term, but avodah continues. This time it's avodat Hashem, and that avodat Hashem is both opens and closes, I would say, the broad sort of Har Sinai covenant beginning in Parshat Mishpatim, even before Mishpatim, truthfully, but prominently in the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, and then at the end of Bahar. And that's the broad context in which we find ourselves when we come to this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha is not in Parshat Bahar, but this week's Parsha, as I said, is in Parshat Tazria. Let me just pause. Are there any questions, comments? Was there any thoughts?
As you were speaking, I guess this is pretty obvious, but it just dawned on me that malacha, the word, is key in the Mishkan.
Yeah.
And that you were using it in connection with, let's say, Shabbos and Bereshis and stuff, and what they couldn't do, right? And then it's picked up again with the Mishkan.
Right, exactly, right. So that exactly, right. So on one hand, you could talk about the shift from avodah, especially avodah Pharaoh, but avodah for Pharaoh versus melacha for God, right? There definitely is that shift. But what I'm arguing is that it's not a total eclipse of the term avodah, right? And yes, I say the word eclipse, even though I'm not in North America. I realize that something happened recently for you folks. But it's not a total eclipse of the term. That there's still the notion of avodah, of being avadim for God, of worshiping God, of course, of not worshiping other gods, etc.
Right. Avadayim v'lo avadim la'avadim.
Exactly. So that's the midrash, avadayim v'lo avadim la'avadim, and that's exactly the drasha which puts limitations on the scope. Right, the scope of the Eved Ivri's engagement with the Adon, and perhaps even workers in general. Exactly. So that writ large is the story of Pesach, but it's also, I think frames importantly where we are in Sefer Vayikra and Parashat Tazria. Okay, with that, let's turn to Parashat Tazria. So Parashat Tazria this gets to your short sheets already, but it starts in chapter 12 of Vayikra. Like I say, normally in most years it's paired with Mitzorah, which are the chapters where Tazria is 12 and 13, right? Yeah, and then 14 and 15 you get into Mitzorah. This year it's separated out. And without dealing with translating the term of Mitzorah, we can call it a leper for our purposes, even though we know that there's much ink spilled about sort of debating whether or not it's actually leprosy or something else entirely. Yeah, let's start here. So on the source sheets, I just pulled out we chapter 13, where we're already discussing the status of the leper, and we will come back, by the way, to the fact that Tazria opens not with the leper, but with the Tumat Yoledet, right, with the woman who's Isha Ki Tazria, the woman who has conceived and is giving birth. We'll come back to that. But for the leper, for the Tzarua, chapter 13, the Torah speaks very stridently. As for the person with a leprous affliction, Tzarua Sherbo Hanega, Bigadav Yihiyu Frumim, his clothes shall be rent. Rosho Yefarua, the head shall be left bare or disheveled or wild. Ba'al Safam Ya'ateh, and their upper lip shall be covered over, right? So imagine sort of maybe the head covering or the scarf or the hood sort of covering over the face of this person. Tameh tameh yikra, and that person shall call out tameh tameh, apparently describing themselves. Tameh tameh yikra. Kol yemei asher nega bo yitma tamehu, that person is impure, is tameh. Badad yeshev, shall be dwell alone. Michutz lamachane moshavo, shall sit alone outside of the camp, shall be his dwelling. And this is the person's the Mitzorah's status and description of their living situation, if you can call it that, while they're in the state of Tumah. And the Torah speaks so stridently here, right, and so dramatically, right, to describe this person sitting outside, rent clothes and head left bare or disheveled, and lips covered over, mouth covered over, until there's a process here of tahara, which is they have to sort of be diagnosed by the priest, by the Kohen, and then go through this whole process, administered or under the guidance of the priest, and eventually they can, with one stage of the process, like in source number 2, chapter 14. They want to be purified, shall wash their clothes and shave off all their hair and bathe in water, rachatz b'mayim v'taher, and can enter back into the machaneh, but still has to wait, 7 days. Apparently, right outside of they can't go into their tent yet. They still have some level of tumah, right, until another 7 days, until more time has passed. So what is happening with this Mitzorah? So I want to argue today. I'm not the first many stretch to argue this, but I want to sort of try to evidence or push for the reading that one thing that's happening with the Mitzorah is somebody who has in some sense touched and experiencing a kind of living death. In some way, they because of, for whatever reason, because of their disease, we can call it that, their spiritual disease, their disease, they're somehow associated with one who has undergoing a quasi-death, a death while they're alive. And the process of tahara is one of kind of rejuvenation. And I'm actually taking my cue here in part from a comment Rav Amnon Bazak made. Rav Amnon Bazak teaches in Yeshivat Har Tzion. He wanted to hypothesize or argue that if you look at the description of what the Mitzorah has to do in chapter 13, the clothes shall be rent, the head shall be left bare, the upper lip shall be covered. So this sounds to us from elsewhere in Tanakh, we'll come to this, and from what we know of Jewish tradition, like mourning rites. Right? It sounds very much like mourning rites. The kriya, right, the tearing of the clothes, the leaving the head unshaven or disheveled, even the covering of the lips. And most communities, I think, don't really do this anymore, but certainly halakha, and there are some that do. I don't know if anybody here knows of a community that does. I'm told the Yemenites do this, and I believe I also heard that the Yekes do something like this. The Germans do something like this, to cover one's head with a covering, right? So some sort of like sequestering, right, or social separation during Avelut. I think I've been heard that Yekes or male Yekes will tip their hat down, for those if they wear hats, right? Will sort of tip it down to cover part of their face. It sounds like a form of mourning, right? So he argued, Rav Bazak, I thought was very interesting. He argued that in a way, the Mitzorah in the course of the purification process is sitting Shiva or is mourning for himself. Sitting Shiva or mourning for himself. Yes.
When Miriam becomes leprous, it's not leprous, whatever. Doesn't Moshe say something like she is as if someone who is dead?
Exactly.
Yes.
So
Al-Natzahi Kamet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let me come to that. That's actually source 4 here. So let me say this. So let's come back to that in 1 second. But that's indeed true. And then I'm going to ask you in a moment what other Mitzoras do we have, or anything like Mitzorah, right, in the Chumash and the Tanakh, and can we sort of build a case here, try to figure this out together and think this through together. But it does sound like this person is what we know of as from mourning rites, and you could argue, perhaps, and I'm not sure that we have to say this, but he argues that the person's kind of sitting Shiva for themselves, right? And they've experienced this quasi-death, and now they're being rejuvenated. They're being, in the course of their return, in the course of the Tahara, they have to go through sort of a mourning process and try to come back. So let's actually go this notion that the Mitzorah is somebody who has experienced a quasi-death, is experiencing something along those lines. So let's start with first with Zella's point. So yes, in the book of Numbers, right, in chapter 12 of Numbers, where Miriam and Aaron speak about Moshe, and God rebukes them. So there, right, God says, Lo chein avi Moshe, right, my servant Moshe is one who I speak to directly, unlike all the other prophets. How could you speak of him? And he gets angry at them. And in verse 10 of chapter 12, the God gets angry. V'hanan sar me'al ha'ohel, and the cloud we just were talking about, right? Removes itself, or removes from the tent. V'hinei Miriam mitzorat kasheleg. Miriam is leprous, or is mitzorah like snow. So Aaron turns to Moshe and he says, please Moshe, and this is a phrase we know from the liturgy, Alna tashet alinu chatat asher no'alnu asher chatanu, right? Please do not count for us the sin which we committed. Here they translate as in folly, which we committed in folly. Al natihi kamet, right? Do not let her be like a dead one, like a dead person. Asher would say tome rechem imo, like when they leave rechem imo, they leave their mother's womb. Vayechel chatzi v'saro, and with flesh happening, right? And actually, by the way, it just occurred to me now that in Parashah Tazria, we first have, right, the discussion of curse of birth and the baby leaving Rechem Imo, basically, and then we get into the Mitzorah. So that just occurred to me. I'm not sure, we could develop that more fully. But the point here is that, right, he's considered like a mate, and kind of paradoxically, if you will, but maybe not, right? It's like this baby which is coming out Mirechem Imo. They actually translate here as a stillborn. I see. Right, this is from the JPS. Asher would say, "To merachem imo echel chetzi v'saros," and let her not be like a stillborn, a specific type of birth. Lo aleinu. Okay, so here we see rather explicitly, though, that the Mitzorah, right, this woman she has leprosy, Miriam does, and she's described as somebody who is kinmate, who is like somebody who is dead. And I was thinking that maybe this helps us understand source number 3. I'm going backwards, but I went out of order, just in line with Zella's good insight, which is in chapter 3 we have not a full-blown Mitzorah, but we have in Exodus an instance of a very quick sarat, right? You have the sources. What are we thinking of? Where do we have a quick
Moshe.
When Moshe, right, puts his arm under the shoulder.
That's exactly. So that's kind of interesting, right? So Moshe says to God in chapter 4 of Exodus, going back to that story, he says, listen, they're not going to believe in me. Lo yaminu v'lo yishma'u koli. Interestingly, there as well, you have some sort of like doubting of Moshe. There, it's hypothetical, or it's anticipated in the story of Bamidbar. It's already in play. Through Moshe, through Aaron and Miriam, but they're not going to believe me. So what are my signs? So God gives him these signs, right? And we have the first sign, which we know is this. God says, "What's in your hands?" He says, "I have my mateh." Throw it on the ground. It turns into a nachash, turns into the snake, right? Moshe flees from it, grab it by its tail. Behold, it's mateh v'chapa. Behold, it becomes a staff again, in his hands. That they might believe in you. Then God says, number 2. Put your hands into your bosom. Behold, his hand is white. Is afflicted, right, with sarat, right? White as snow. Right here they translate it as was encrusted with snowy scales. Okay, so some sort of scaly. That's how they're reading it. Some sort of scaly condition. Put your hand back into your bosom. Puts it back in. Takes it out, and his flesh has been restored, right? And then we know, the third one, which is if they don't listen to the first one and the second one, here's the third one. You'll take water from the Yaor, from the river, pour it into the dry land. Take out the water and from the river, and it'll become blood, right? So we have the staff turning into the snake and back, the hand turning, leprous and returned, and then the water turning into blood. So it occurred to me that in all of these there might be, and this has to do with reading the Metzora as someone who is sort of quasi dead or is experiencing quasi death. All of these might be read as engaging with life and death, meaning, right, taking something which is, let's say, the staff, which is inanimate, and then it becomes this live chash, it becomes alive, then it becomes inanimate. Or taking the hand, which is perfectly healthy, and then it's afflicted with leprosy, right? So it's quasi dead, right? And then it's healed, and perhaps the water to blood has a similar resonance as well, right? Mayim chayim, and the source, so this living source of life, and then turning into blood. What the exact meaning of that is, we could go in different directions. For our purposes here, and I'd love to hear. Yeah, Sandra, why don't we pause there? What do you want to say?
Yeah, I think it's actually very relevant, and I had made a little circle around it just as you're saying that about the Dam and the Or, because if in fact Pharaoh was the god of the Nile, the god of everything, he was above Ra, he was above the god of the Nile, then turning the source of the life in Egypt, which was the Nile, into blood, which was in any culture at that time, certainly in the ancient Near East, a symbol of death, certainly at some point. And anyway, they couldn't drink it or bathe in it or clean in it once it was suffused with blood. I think it's absolutely the kamate part of our analysis. I think that those 3 instances, 100% are life versus death, life versus death. And the reason I think it is because God has the same problem, only on a different scale, convincing Moses to be his emissary in Egypt. I mean, the task that he's taking on, and convincing Pharaoh of who he is, of who he with a capital H is, of who God is. Pharaoh says, I don't know you. And then Moses says, I'm not going. I'm out of here. I'm on the lam. They want to kill me. I got them on both sides. Pharaoh wants to kill me. The Hebrews want to kill me. I'm going. So I think that God's got a problem with both. And the only thing that really he can do is show them how he is in control of the life and death force. I absolutely agree with you. I think it's 100% connected to the life and death.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? So feel free to jump in, but so I read. So it sounds like me and Sandra are reading it in similar ways, and I think I do. I read it also in terms of the resonance, or like what's the point of this life and death. I also think, I suspect that that's what it's saying. It's saying, you're not going to trust me, Moshe, as an emissary of God. They're not going to trust God, and the response is, I am indeed I am indeed the one in control of, as you say, the life and death forces respectively, right? They don't exist above me. In fact, I control them, right? And I'll demonstrate that through these three. By the way, is there anything to do with the nachash and the mateh? Is there anything, the wood stick? Is there anything about that, sort of linking back to Eden? Maybe, I'm not sure. But even without that, leaving that alone, I do suspect that's what's happening there, right? And that's similarly what's happening. Let me say one more thing. That's what's happening in Bimidbar, right? Where Aaron, it's interesting whether the Aaron, the Kohen, turns to Moshe, the prophet, right? And rather than sort of being metaher her himself, Aaron, according to the prescriptions of Leviticus, he sort of says, what are we going to do with her? They turn to Moshe, right? And Moshe, please intercede here and intervene. And Moshe turns to God, right? On the El Narafan Allah, right? The poignant and laconic prayer. El Narafan Allah. Please God, hear. Actually, there are those, by the way, the custom of when they hear, let's say, ambulance sirens or anything along those lines, who, without knowing who's, what the circumstances, El Narafan Allah, right? A quick, general prayer. El Narafan Allah. So God there responds and says, God responds, right? That's not a topic right now, but right, Aviha Yarok Faneha, she should not be sort of, her father has sort of spit in her face, would she not be, locked up or put aside for 7 days? And that's what happens. When that already sounds like the Masorah proper, right? That sounds like we're approaching the rite of the Masorah, where the person is set outside for 7 days, and then they can come back into the camp. But interesting, Aaron does not deploy the full regimen, right? The Torah HaMetzorah, and how to be Metaher Metzorah that we know from Leviticus. Instead, the Kohen, turns to Moshe, the prophet, and asks him to pray, right? And Moshe, or to intervene in some way, or right, at least somehow forgive him, something like along those lines. Moshe prays to God and cries out to God. And eventually to try to restore her. But here as well, you have the sense that what's being demonstrated, right, is that God through Moshe is taking this person who has touched death, right, on Lathi Chamet, and is set outside of the camp, outside of life, has to go the process there, right, outside for those full 7 days, and then can be brought in. And all of this gets reinforced in the Haftorah for Tazria, which we read when we have a non-leap year, and we read it separately. Also, the Haftorah of Tazria Metzorah from the book of Kings. This is on page 3.
Excuse me, can I?
Yes.
I was just thinking that I think the reason he turns to Moshe is because Moshe was the person who, quote unquote, was wronged. And before she can be mechapered for this whole thing, Moshe first has to forgive her. And then you can go and beseech God. Like we always say on Yom Kippur, Hashem is not going to be mechaper you for sins until you've gone to the person whom you've wronged and asked them for mechila, and then Hashem can do the rest of the magic. So I think here, Aaron feels my hands are tied. I can't go and do all the rituals if the original cause for all of this has not been accounted for. So let me go to Moshe, let me speak with him. If he can acquit her of the original cause for this, then we can go further. And since it's Moshe, he can he is a direct line. So why should I get involved? And
Right.
afterwards, Hashem says she still has to do this the time. In other words, we get back to the same place, but we've just gotten there in an alternate route.
That's very interesting, actually. Thank you. Right, and that we should think about the use of al nat tashet alinu chatat asher na'olam shechatanu, right, in our liturgy for the high holidays, and think about that in relation to the passage here. So thank you. So
John?
Yes.
But isn't there, maybe you said this at the beginning before I entered, but isn't there a rabbinic tradition, and we see it in Rashi, that certain people are chashuv kamet? So mitzorah is one of them, and an ani
Right.
is one
Or
of them.
an ani, for example. Right.
Right, exactly. For some reason, I think there's a third, but I can't think of it. So clearly the rabbis, saw some connection there, that you're developing it, but there's some kernel of connection there because it's one of those categories.
Right, for sure. I want to push, and then Emily will take your point. I'm going to push in a few minutes. We have about 20 minutes left. I want to push in a few minutes to sort of a thought that emerges from there. That's just to say that if the Mitzorah is somebody who has sort of experienced death in some microcosmic fashion, then their Torah is a form of rejuvenation, and maybe that says something about broader about Sefer Vayikra. I guess that's where I'm going to try. So I'm trying to go with the rest of our time here. But Emily, please go ahead. I actually have to, Emily, after speaking, I have to turn off my camera for 1 second to set my chart, plug in my phone. But I'm my computer, but I'm listening. Wait, sorry, you're muted.
Like maybe another layer of this emotionally is these texts and these narratives seem to be, and the halachot seem to be pointing to an awareness that the boundary between maybe severe illness and death is, is kind of porous. It's not as strict a boundary as we think. So when you talk about the Mitzorah as, as dead, when you talk about the Mitzorah as mourning himself, I think that emotionally that actually rings true to me. I can imagine that happening, a person who's experiencing severe illness, with challenges his experience of life. And I can imagine that, we know that happens to people in that kind of life, and that they almost think about, they are mourning themselves in some way, even if everything works out okay. And similar, the rejuvenation there. Also, it's interesting that there's halacha through the Tarat imagines a need for some kind of a ritual re-entry into normal, into the community after the isolating, trauma of severe illness.
I think you're making a very important point, actually, or at least in my mind, so that the Torah here is reflecting. I'm sort of saying back what you said. I'm not adding anything. The Torah is reflecting, right, a human experience of sort of precariousness, right, in which we touch death, right, many times in our lives, sometimes in scarier or more immediate ways than others, and maybe we like to imagine, because of I don't know what sort of professionalization in the medical field or something, whatever it is, like there's a separate spheres where one goes to die, and then there's a separate, and the life itself. But actually, the two actually come together much more proximately than we might, always think about it. So that definitely sort of resonates with me. Thank you. So I should say in the Haftorah, right, the story of in Haftorah, there's several stories, right, in Kings of there's a few stories, first of all, of Tzaraat, and Haftorah deals with a case of Tzaraat with the prophet Elisha, vis-a-vis, or with the story of the prophet Elisha. Remember that Elisha like Eliyahu, his teacher, Elisha has previously, I think it's early in this chapter, has previously actually resurrected, basically, right, this child, right? Or this, at this point, this young man who had passed away, whose birth he had sort of announced, and then she passed away, and then he sort of rejuvenates him. And in this story in the Haftorah, which I'm not going to read at length, sorry Zella, maybe we did this together last year, I don't remember we did this Haftorah together, but we had the great story of Naaman, the commander of the kingdom of Aram, who is he's described as both a Gibor Chayil, whatever that means, a mighty warrior or something along those lines, and a Mitzorah. Interesting pairing, Gibor Chayil and a Mitzorah. So he's both, on the one hand, probably a very important figure militarily and politically, and also he's a Mitzorah. So for all I know, he's kind of a bit sidelined and maybe an outcast. We don't know exactly, right? Gibor Chayil speaks of strength, and Mitzorah speaks of not strength per se, right? Certainly not someone who sort of their body appears to be decomposing in front of our very eyes, touching this. So long story short, right? They encounter raiding, and they carry off this young girl from this young Israelite, woman, and she basically informs them that there's this prophet, Elisha, this prophet in Samaria. He can cure Naaman of his sarat, of his leprosy. He's not sure, right? He tells his lord, right, of this, and Ladonav, and the king says to him, go, and go. I'll send a letter to the king of Israel. And anyway, so go to Israel. He goes, and he brings this letter, and it's the letter which reached the king of Israel. This is verse 6. I'm on page 4 of the source sheet. It says, when this letter reaches you, you'll know that I've sent I've sent Naaman to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. Shalachti lechet Naaman avdi v'asavto mitzarato. So the king, so the king reads this and tears his clothes, and he says, "Ha'elohimani lahamitu lachayot, ki zeh sholech elai la'asov ish mitzarto." Is it my God to deal death or to give life? That this fellow writes to me, that this person writes to me to cure a man of leprosy, la'asov ish mitzarto, right? It must be a pretext. First of all, right there, it's very, very explicit, right? That he's charged with curing someone of leprosy, and he understands it as, am I God who has the control over death and life, over those life and death forces? You see how he understands at least association between the two, right? I'm not God. Only God can really do that, and he's distraught, right? Well, how can I do this? Eventually, Elisha says, "Send him to me." He goes to Elisha. Elisha says, "Go and bathe 7 times in the Jordan, and you'll be restored." And he is, Naaman is, and then Naaman is angry. He says, what kind of instruction is that? I'm coming to you. I traveled all this way for like a real powerful potion or some sort of procedure. I could have diagnosed myself, myself at home. It's like if you go to a doctor and they tell you, what you need if you make an appointment, you need, rest and ice and elevation, and you're like, yeah, I got that off of, forget WebMed, FMD, I got that off of Google. So I didn't need that. So he says, what do I need to go do for that? Right. And you see what he wants. It's like some sort of like dramatic, like really complicated or impressive procedure, but they say, no, go ahead and do it. And he does it, and his flesh becomes like that of a little boy's, and he's pure, right? So he becomes rejuvenated, basically, right? And that's my point about Elisha rejuvenating the child earlier. This is the same story in a way. It's a story of taking somebody who is dead or has touched death and rejuvenating them. And
John?
Yes.
No, I was just thinking, I don't have the text in front of me, but if the king said, who am I to lasso, something with the lasso,
Yeah.
right?
that's
So
the
I
line.
was thinking,
Oh,
right, Vasavto. So I was thinking that often, at least in Bereshit, the expression of when someone dies is what
yeah,
Asaf el Amav, Vayesof el Amav.
that is very interesting. Right, right. That is interesting. Yeah, here it sounds like bringing them back into their living people, right? Well, that one I assume sounds like going back to like their ancestors, But you're right. That is very interesting. So he gets purified, and basically he becomes rejuvenated, and this is something that Elisha does, right? Elisha, like Eliyahu, is able to. The prophet is able to help purify, able to help rejuvenate. And it's interesting. Naaman wants to give a gift, and he refuses it. So eventually, his servant Gehazi actually does try to get the gift, but it's interesting that he says that he refuses the gift. As God lives, who I serve, I will not accept anything. And I wonder, in terms of a commentary on the Haftorah of the Parsha, excuse me, this does go to what we did last year. That one thing that might be happening here, beyond and reading or reinforcing the notion of the Metzora as someone who's quasi-dead, is also perhaps an intervention. And what I mean by that is, if you read Vayikra and you see the focus on the Kohen and the control, the power that the Kohen has in terms of the purity, regime, specifically by the Metzora. The Kohen has to diagnose. The Kohen has to sort of guide the process. So you would not be, and this is true about the Metzora, but it's true, in other places in the Yikra, I'd say at large. So you could imagine that the Kohen would start to see themselves or be seen not merely as some sort of a functionary, but actually as the source of that power. The source of that power, one who's in control of that power, and that sense and that self-perception, perception by others could easily lead to corruption and a misunderstanding of the whole process. And this is where we find ourselves in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, right, where the sons of Eli, who are these Kohanic functionaries at the tabernacle, have become exactly corrupt in that vein, right? That they become they're overtaking, they're abusing their function, and that's a real risk of anybody who is in an important role, which one which has power and one which has control. Not that those are necessarily bad things, power and control, but there is a risk associated with them. And I wonder if part of the commentary of the Haftorah, with the humility, essentially, I'd say, of Elisha. I mean, he both knows his capacity, but he also understands that it's from God and not from him, and therefore that may be why he won't take any reward from Naaman or any payment from Naaman, because he's insisting on remaining humble, seeing himself as God's prophet and not himself the source of, as the king says, the source of the power, right, over life and death, and one who actually is rejuvenating. So that may be one of the things that the Haftorah here is doing. Okay, so far what we've claimed so far is that, and again, others have claimed this as well, but I hope perhaps we've nuanced it a bit, is a reading of Metzora as one who is experiencing some form of death or quasi-death or something, that some experience which is proximate to or resonant with death, and as such has to go through a process of tahara, which in this context means a process of rejuvenation. And I was thinking that, and here I shift from what I think is fairly, you can make the argument that this is fairly well sourced. You can make the argument is ape shot of the text. Here I get into hypothesis land, but amongst my Drisha friends, I like to learn live and share hypotheses, and we'll see how it lands, see what you think. Is if you think about this process of the Metzora becoming rejuvenated, and then the general book of Vayikra, what's happening there? I mean, you basically people who are sin, right, and then achieve kapara, right, who are then forgiven, and all of these things. In a way, you're describing a world, right? We started right with this sort of picture, this this theoretical or ideal, in a sense, world that Leviticus describes, a world in which God lives in your center, or God lives among you, and in which death is inevitable on the one hand, but also there's a possibility for rejuvenation. There's actually the possibility for, if you will, right, coming alive again, of trumping death, right, of resurrection in a sense, right?
Well, that's, excuse me, that's the word shuvah. You return.
Right, return to, in this sense, return to life, you're saying. Right, so
you sin, you move away, then you have a karban, karov, you come close, and that enables you to do tshuva, which is returning to the source.
Absolutely. So on the one hand, you could talk about that in sort of spatial, horizontal term, imagery, right? That's to say, you're close and far, very distant. You're in the camp, you're out of the camp, you're in your tent, you're out of the tent, et cetera, et cetera. You've left, and now you're returning to. But there's also a sense in which we encounter death, right? And then we can come back and encounter life again. And here's where I want to get to have a little hypothesis I should just share with you, see if it lands and see if it resonates, and do with it what you will. But it makes me wonder if it makes me think about where did we first encounter death as an inevitable and sort of irreparable part of our condition? That's the story of Eden. And the story of Eden, we're trying to live with God in the same place, but there, because of sin, we encounter death, and death becomes part of the human condition, which is beyond repair. Now, if you read the story in the Chumash, you actually have 7 days there, right, in the first chapter, in the beginning of the second chapter. Right? The humans created along with the animals on the 6th day, and then you have Shabbat, right, and then we have the next part. So in a way, the next part is kind of like the 8th day. Right? Here's where I get to, where I'm really not, I'm sort of just throwing this out there to see if it sticks. The 8th day, and then the 8th day is where we therefore encounter in the garden, where we encounter we sin, right? We were supposed to, we were living eternally, right? And then took from the tree of knowledge and essentially become mortal. So what if we think of Sefer Vayikra as a what if? What if Sefer Vayikra is kind of an imagined world, a redo of that 8th day, right? A day in which you can still live with God within the space, recognizing human capacity for sin, for our maybe the inevitability of sin, of our inevitable encounter with death at various sort of iterations or various types of death, right? And then on this 8th day, on this Shemini though, on this 8th day though, right? We have the ability to, in this world, to actually become alive again, to actually come back in and live again. And I think that if there's anything to that, it reminds me of, or I was actually partly thinking of this because of a midrash at the beginning of Tazria, which is on page. It's on the last sources here. I guess on page 6, sources 9 and 10. In the beginning of Tazria, we have God speaks to Moshe. Isha ki Tazria v'yalda zachar v'tama shivat yamim kimei nidat devotat titma. Right, that she should, she's impure for 7 days for the male, right, and double for the female. Ubayom hashmini yimo b'sar or lato. And on the 8th day here, we have the Milah on this 8th day. And Rashi there, commenting on the order of the passages in Vayikra before Tazria, we're talking about the kashrut of the animal kingdom, and then we talk about the human being. So Amar Rabbi Simlai, and I'll end it with this. Amar Rabbi Simlai, Kishem sheyitzirato shel adam achar kol behema chay va'of maseh breshit, kach torato in his Parashah achar torat behema chay va'of. Rabbi Simlai says, just like at the time of Breshit, at the formation of the animals and the human, first on the sixth day, the animals are created and the birds, and then, and only then, is the human being created. So too in Vayikra, first we have the Torah of the animals, and then we get to Tazria, the Torah of the human being, and their purity and their impurity. So what does Bereshit have to do with this at all? And again, when we read Parashah Pikudei, for those who are here, we talked about the building of the Mishkan as sort of another creation. And along those lines, or maybe it's somewhat of a separate thought, I have to think it, I'm not sure, but it also makes me wonder if we have here a sort of a sequel, a redoing, right? A what if of the creation story, the animals, the people, and then what else in our book here is reckoning or sort of evoking the original creation stories and commenting on them in some way. And what I'm hypothesizing here, and I wouldn't call it a theory yet because it's too much of a hunch at this point. But I'm hypothesizing is that what you have in Vayikra is a reimagined world, a world in which you can have v'shachanti b'tocham, and yet you can also have sin and inevitability of death. But, and here's the rub, the possibility of Eitz Chaim hi lamacha zikim ba, it is the tree of life, the Torah, the capacity, the potential to remain with God, and the potential for rejuvenation and an alternate imagined world. And that's the world of Vayikra. What happens into the real? So for that, we'll have to tune back in when we get into Sefer B'Midbar. Okay, so today we took a little bit of a travel both towards Pesach, Avadim, Avadayim, at the beginning, and the broad structure, the bookends of Exodus and Vayikra, but then we focused in on Tazria, and I suppose what we tried to do, besides talking about Tazria itself, trying to understand the resonance of the Metzora as someone who's touching some form of death or approximate experience of a death-like experience, is we used it as a way of positing, sort of floating a hypothesis about, much broader hypothesis about the way Vayikra is functioning in conversation with the very beginnings of Bereshit. All right, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to learn with you all. I'll hang on for a couple minutes if anybody wants to chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John,
Does anyone have any more comments or questions
I
Or
do.
thoughts,
Is he-
disagreements,
John?
or
or
anything?
thoughts?
Sure.
Wait, are you still there? I
uh-huh.
don't see you.
I'm here.
Okay, I just don't see you. Okay, so I was just thinking about the Ishanida and the idea
Yeah.
that people, that why is it considered by some a quasi-death experience? Because she, could have become pregnant and bring life into the world, and she didn't. So, but it's the same thing with the Baal Keri, the whole idea of wasting the opportunity to bring life.
Right.
Is another example.
Right, wasting opportunity to get life, and also encountering coming into, this goes like to Emily's point, right? Like sort of touching mortality,
Right.
touching mortality, and returning, recognizing that and returning from that. Think about benching Gomel, by the way. Like Emily spoke about, right? Rituals of return. So the ritual of reciting this Gomel, right? This prayer, right? Recognizing the gift of life, right? Because you're giving me life, right? After such an experience, is a way of saying you're giving me life. I appreciate my life now because it was at risk. It was at risk. As simple as that. And all those cases that one would sort of bench Gomel. It's a way of giving expression to that.
Right.
For sure. All right, everybody. Chag Sameach. We'll pick it up after the holiday. Take care.
Great.
Thanks, Evie.
Hey, Chag Sameach to everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Kelsen. Thank you, everyone who joined us, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook. Just a couple announcements that next week we have Sophia Stepansky, who will be teaching this class. And then we also have Mishnah in Depth continuing with the new Masechet. It will be with Rabbi Avi Wolfish on Sundays at 1 p.m. for Nazir and Sotah. You can sign up on our website. It's drisha.org/courses/Mishnah in Depth. And I hope to see you there. And lehitraot.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, for Mishnah Yomit, I really want to encourage everybody. Obviously, Avi Wolfish is a world expert, and we're thrilled to have him teaching. And please do consider joining us with the learning live and also on your own time. All right, bye everybody. Thank you.